I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm really delighted to be here with Vivienne Binns in her studio to have a conversation. And Viv, you know, you've made a tremendous contribution to Australian art, and you've been acknowledged for your great work with community arts. And I'd like to start by just thinking of this great spirit of inventiveness in your work and this curiosity. And I'm wondering if you can tell us how it was growing up and just what the atmosphere was like in your family. Was there that kind of feeling of adventure a little bit in the household?
Yes, there was. Growing up, I was a great one for play acting on the back veranda in all sorts of ways and building cubbies. And I remember my mother used to watch me out the kitchen window onto the veranda, and I'd be out there with a great big girls' own book or boys' own book of something with a rug around my shoulders, and I'd be preaching. Preaching. I'd be having put from the pulpit. So, you know, that started long ago. And at one stage I thought that what I'd really like to be would be a theatre designer. Mm-hmm. I could have done that. I was quite keen on that, and we did do a little bit of that kind of thing when I went to college. But I know from pretty early on that I wanted to do something to do with the arts. It wasn't necessarily painting, but, you know, I loved making things. And, you know, there was a time when I thought I wanted to be a weaver because Mum had some friends who had looms and were part of the Weavers Guild and so on, and I thought that was utterly fascinating until I got a loom for myself and found out how long it took to string the whole thing up. That put me off a bit. But by the time I got to art school, I still wasn't, you know, necessarily towards this or towards that. And as I say, I was interested in the idea of theatre design. But in the end, when it came to choosing a workshop, I actually went for painting. Right. And I can tell you it's probably because, you know, my closest colleagues and friends and artists amongst the students went to painting. I could have gone to sculpture, but at that time, you know, painting was the one I chose, so that set me on a certain path.
So that's interesting, Viv. So you go to art school, and I just am wondering, when you got to art school and you were mixing with all these other people who wanted to be artists or were artists already, and did you find that atmosphere liberating? And can you just take us through a little bit of the background towards that first exhibition in 1967, that really famous exhibition at Watter's Gallery that you had?
Those years weren't easy. I mean, I think at that time I went through quite a bit of kind of adolescent anxiety and so on, and I think, you know, as all young people, I was trying to work out who I was and what I was, and, you know, sexuality was problematic. So, you know, I think there was a few years there when I was probably somewhat depressed, but I loved doing what I was doing. And of course, at that time too, all of those things that, you know, the feminists have talked about in terms of male, dominance of male lecturers and dominance of female students, and also the male, you know, the predatory tendency of males to, you know, not be able to quite keep their hands off the, you know, but it was a real mixture of a sort of sexual atmosphere, because, you know, we were up there in the cross and you know, in those days it was the bohemian, and, you know, so there were gay people, but it wasn't like now.
Well, you were serious, but you also, I think, if I'm right, you really picked up on this whole thing with, you know, the Dada spirit and being interested in surrealism and the subconscious mind. And, you know, I think it's really so interesting to look back at those works, two of which are now in the National Gallery collection of Vagdens and Phallic Monument. And, you know, when I look at them even now, I'm struck by the courage that you had, by the sense of inventiveness, and being obviously drawing on these other things, but also being very true to yourself.
By the time I was in the last years, I'd really caught on to something about spatial relationships and fluid plastic relationships on the page. As I say, John Olsen was, you know, the first person who really explained clearly what Picasso was doing when he seemingly distorted the figure, and how he was actually, this was the transition to recognising the power of the rectangle and the limits of the picture plane, and how that impacted on the forms within. And that was a real eye-opener, and there's a whole lot of drawings I did in those latter years. It's all about that fluidity and plasticity and the tension between forms on the page. Art is not something that simply belongs in the museums and history books. That when we opened our eyes and looked around us, we saw creativity and invention in all sorts of things around us, by children, by ordinary, so-called ordinary people, by people in our family, by people who were just considered, you know, not important and amateurish and so on. And this, for me, certainly was a big question mark. Well, because I could see in some of this work something that, for me, was what art was.
Yeah.
In those paintings, that I realised what it meant for me to be an artist. You know, I felt it physically, and they were sort of so revelatory in terms of the way they'd emerged and the way that they were unexpected, that they weren't, you know, they had this revelatory quality about them that came intuitively, things that it was the first experience of that kind of thing, things that I didn't even know existed in me. So,
you went on to do working in enamel, and you made a number of portraits. In fact, there was an exhibition, wasn't there, of three of you actually working on portraits of women. But tell me a little bit how you came to work in enamel and what that represented.
Well, after that first exhibition and that process of breaking through, you know, my background, conditioning and so on, to actually, you know, I was doing I guess a good old Freudian sort of self-investigation, but it was very, I had to be really quite ruthless, of course, to get underneath all that conditioning and to break through that. And at a certain point, and it was very difficult, you know, it was very hard and exhausting work. That's very hard work, that ruthless self-examination and questioning. And I isolated myself pretty much off from a lot of the world. I was just interested in people who were intensely, it was off my head, I think, for a lot of that time. And but, you know, it was very intense. But I was driven. And then one day, you know, I'm always working and trying to find my way, and did a lot of these drawings and little drawings and so on. And then there was a point at which it was like this real breakthrough, you know, it was like the gates opened and these drawings just started to flow. I hardly had to think about it. It was as if, you know, they virtually, in a way, appeared on the page, and I just had to kind of trace around them. And that was when the paintings of Vagdens and so on, and they were the organic, that was the part of the outflowing of that too. What I find really interesting was that, say, with the women's movement, the women's art movement, I wasn't part of the women's movement, but I came to it through this collection that Barbara got together, and you know, we eventually became the women's art movement. That's what sort of politicised me in that way. What I found very interesting, because we had all this collective work, and later I discovered, as into the 80s, a lot of young people were very envious of us having been able to do that collective work. But of course, as with all collective things, it wasn't all smooth playing. But the other thing that with the women's art movement, in setting up the slide registry, we wanted work by women from all over. There weren't that many professional artists, women, but there were a lot of women who did things.
Yes.
So we were wanting to see, what do women do? And so a lot of the exhibitions we had were open. Anybody could put something in. Now, you know, the keepers of the flame thought this was terrible, and we were accused of lowering standards all the time. You know, there was a total misunderstanding of that impulse to explore and see what people actually are doing, whether they're trained or not. The exhibitions themselves don't carry with them the vibrancy, the opening up, the excitement of what actually happened. You know, it's like the sun was shining and the ground was moving, you know, it was really fantastic. And a lot of barriers were being broken down, which were put up again as we went on into the 80s. And
I think, you know, when you look at the wall of posters in the Know My Name exhibition, there is actually a great sense of vibrancy, and it's interesting that a lot of the issues that people were looking at are still current today, like, you know, people like Marie McMahon talking about, you know, Aboriginal land rights, and of course collectives of Indigenous and non-Indigenous women, of women's shelters, things against rape and violence against women, and they're still things that we're wrestling with today.
Yeah.
But I think you really do get that sense of incredible activism and vibrancy. And, you know, I think what you were talking about there too with women's work, you know, there was also a celebration of things like women's needlework and the doily projects.
And icing cakes.
But, you know, really making it feel inclusive, and this idea of art and life coming together. And one of the projects that you worked on that has become very much celebrated in the 1980s is Mother's Memories, Others' Memories. And can you tell us a little bit about that, what that experience was like?
Was looking at, you know, what women had done, and in particularly what sort of things women made, the artefacts, etc. It started also out of this fact that in talking to our parents, I started talking to my mother, and we were getting together the family album. I had discovered through the teaching that I did, which was usually of, pretty much always of women, older women, that I was always looking for the place where they found that spark that brought forth what I felt was this kind of real creative impulse. And I noticed that women would light up, most women would light up when you started to talk about the family album. And with many of them, they were busy creating the family album. And we, in discussing this in some of the women's groups, people would show the album that was their mother had made of their life, And their mother's view of their life wasn't necessarily how they viewed their own life, that this was an interpretive process that was also, trying to shape the future as you wanted. But nonetheless, in amongst that, because of the passion that was brought to it, there was a real creative quality. And I thought, right, we don't have to start with learning how to draw a square or something or other. We start with where we're really excited, something that really is of real significance to us, real significance to us. And that was the place where this thing, this art thing, this interpretive thing, and it really starts. So that became the foundation, and as it developed into a project, due to some grants, and I worked on it at the University of New South Wales in the General Studies Department, and they were very interested in social activity and so on, and they wanted a project that would bring together not only people in the university, staff and students, but also connected to the outside. And so Mother's Memories was really good because the idea was to invite people to be part of it, and that would be to examine and tell a story of the lives and creative activities of women in their lives. Men and women could join, but it was about women. And the significant thing that pointed out to me that this was like a little bomb, that people came in smiling, lots of people I knew, hello Viv, and went in and they went around the exhibition looking at all these stories of families, relationships, of making things, and they came out. And sometimes they couldn't look at me. They might put their hand up like this and say, I'll talk to you later, Viv. And others would say, I've got to go and talk to my mother. I've got to go and talk to my aunt, my grandmother, People were really stirred. And so that showed me immediately the power of these familial relationships. And
That's so interesting. I think that, tapping into that idea of mother's memories, others' memories, and, you can see how there's an evolution from your own work, thinking about those portraits of your own mother at different times of her life that you did, and that's interesting because they're often complex relationships and things aren't straightforward. And as you say, people see them differently.
Some participants couldn't continue with their project because their mother may say to them, look, this is just for you, not for public.
And it's interesting to look at that project in relation to Tower of Babel. You have very generously gifted Tower of Babel to the National Gallery of Australia, and we're very excited to be showing the work in the Know My Name exhibition. And in a way, the work is like an exhibition in itself because it's got so many participants, and there are your friends, there's family, and there are other artists, and in a way it is something like your community. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I invited people who I'd worked with on projects. There are people I know, there are people in my family, there are other artists that practice at the time. There's only one child in this, but they're all, with every one of the people who participated, there was a connection, some kind of personal connection that just sort of electrified that connection. And for me, each of those boxes represents a different context through the person who worked. And I just would give people a box, ask them to do just what they do. just do what you do, you know, whatever you do. And I'd say if you look very carefully, you can start to see that, but it's something else that's a bit, it can become a bit like a potpourri when you put, but then that has its own truth about it. It had a very serious, it was part of my investigation of how do you understand what art is, and also starting to look at how do we value it and why do we value it the way, and is that appropriate to evaluate it in the way that, you know, galleries and art historians and critics evaluate it. And each box has a designated place, because there are about 80 boxes, and
yeah, I mean, it's one of, I think, the biggest community arts projects in one work. And,
possibly,
you know,
yeah.
I think what's so interesting, Sue Best wrote beautifully about the work and called it like a hinge work between so-called high art and community art, and you really cut through something there.
Yeah.
And I think that's so important about that work, and it's a link right back to what you were saying, growing up with stories and then questioning what art can be. And you know, it leads to another dimension of your project and your artwork, which was in memory of an unknown artist. And you know, we have a couple of those works which we acquired, you know, Nylon Over the Lachlan and Japanese Fabric No. 3, that are both works in memory of artists who may not be remembered. And I find that very moving.
I wanted to find a way, as I moved back into the studio, of referencing and remembering the people that lie outside of the recognised realms of the artist. And so the more I looked at it, everything I look at has got an unknown artist working away in it. And I started working with a lot of fabrics, and at that stage I was also developing a way of surfacing that moved me from oils into acrylics, and I realised I wasn't making a painting in the traditional sense. I was actually making moulded plastic surfaces, and I found I could rake the acrylic in all sorts of ways that and it started out as me looking for a way of simulating fabrics, rather than, you know, that painting thing with the eye and the vision, you know, the idea of, you know, colour and shadow, and, you know, I was looking for something that simulated rather than represented in that traditional way of, you know, painting what we see. And that was pretty fascinating, because it often, I'd have the piece of fabric around, I've got some over in the drawer there, that and it'd sit around for ages before that little penny would drop as to how I could do it. And then I thought, and then it came to me, well, I'm just going to call it in memory of the unknown artist, and it might be like a, you know, nylon mat. And now, but so much of what I do is sort of in memory of the unknown artist. It's also that thing of keeping in mind where your influences come from, you know, and a kind of a legitimate way. And I mean, it was, of course, there was so much going on about soldiers and war memorials and so on. And I think, what about the forgotten artists, you know? What about...
Totally. But I think it's interesting, because it's sort of also what you were saying to me about process and relationships, and it's about the way things come together and interrelate, and, you know, so you might let things sit for a while and work on you, but it's having that ability to see something in it, or as you've said,
occur to you, it's sort of,
yeah, to work on you, to have that vibration.
Point, something occurs, you know.
Yeah.
That's very important. I'm glad you brought that up, because it's the thing that I would most like people to understand about my practice, that gradually over the years I've seen that this remains true all the way through going back. the central tenets of my practice are not material, style. There's philosophy and ideas there, but essentially, centrally, it's about process and relationship. I want to know how things fit together, trying to understand this business of process, the processes that and the relationships that occur in that process, no matter, it could be in dance, it could be in materials or so on, but because those things are non-material, they're, ephemeral, but that's what has enabled me to move from, craft, so-called, to art, to enamelling, to performance, which I've done in the past. Because that's been the central thing for me, is how the process and continues, and it's not just a material process. And in fact, as I've grown older, the process that I've come to understand more and more is more the process of the internal kind of process. I talked about the rigorous self-examination in that early work, but I've learned a lot more as to how to think about these things, of course, in a lifetime. I remember when I was a student, your lecturer would come round and would talk about what's on the surface and what's wrong with it, and this colour doesn't, or this shape and this line. None of that. I did learn very early that wasn't actually where the changes were needed, that it was something coming through the artist. And maybe some self-deception, some dishonesty, and so there's this, what I talked about before, that kind of quality of a kind of a keenness, a sense of some kind of truth that comes out through you doing the process, and just allowing yourself to pick up on those things, and it by trusting something in here. And that's what happened when I realised doing vague dens and what it meant to be an artist, because I hit that kind of sense of knowing that's something true,
Viv, I think, listening to you talk, I can see that over the years you would have made many students' lives very rich through your teachings.
I have no idea.
And also, through your own art and through your incredible work with community, it really adds up to something so important in our visual culture. And, as we are in this period of looking at Know My Name and celebrating women artists, I think something that we need to do is keep remembering these stories. I think one of the pivot points of the exhibition is the 70s, because of how important that was with people like you and others. But then it's also the evolving, and it's really, I feel very reassuring in the present, that my experience with artists is that they are keenly interested, and I think other people will be too. So, just to finish off, I think in terms of women's practice and the work you've done, I just want to say thank you very, very much for, all that you've done and the great inspiration you've given.
Thank you very much. It's been one long exploration.
That's great. Thanks, Viv.